Hello, Sharon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Laura.
It's been a long time coming. I know we had to get our schedule straight, but I'm really glad that you're here right now because there's a lot going on. I know you have a new book out. We're going to make sure we talk about. And the subject is one that has been very important to me and that I know our listeners really, really want some answers on. And that is the subject of boundaries. What are boundaries? How do we set appropriate boundaries? How do we even know what that means? So I have tons of questions for you in this area. First of all, what made you interested in boundaries as sort of like a focal point for your
Mm.
practice?
Yeah, it's a good question. And what really happened was when I was working with clients, I kept seeing themes, but not themes as in everybody had the exact same problem, but it was really that all of the problems could be understood or framed in terms of them being boundary issues of one kind or another.
Yeah.
So that's really how I started down that path is going, wow, like everything is about boundaries. They're so foundational to all of our relationships, even the way we interact with ourselves and people, institutions, like everything in your life is really about boundaries, which might sound like
Yeah.
it's an overstatement, but that's really the conclusion that I came to is, boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. That's what people need to understand is how do I set boundaries? How can I set them effectively? How can I not feel lousy about doing them? How can they not sort of derail my relationships and my life and so forth? And then I went looking for resources and couldn't find quite what I was looking for.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's why I ended up writing books about boundaries and articles and creating other resources for people around that. Is that typically is what happens? Is I
Yeah.
want some kind of particular resource, right, for both for myself and for my clients. And then when I can't find exactly that thing, I think, okay, well let's create something that I feel like is going to hopefully do the job for people and give them that information and a way to actually practice the skills. I think that's really important as well, especially when we're talking about things of this nature that are both we want to think about or we want to sort of look at the way that we're thinking about it, but also we need to look at the way that we're behaving and probably make some shifts in both of those places. And so for me anyway, just reading about something is a good starting place, but then I actually need to know, okay, what am I going to actually do different to make this different in my life? So I like to have really practical, concrete, actionable things that people can do as well.
That is so on point. I find there are definitely those folks that read every self-help book and greatly educated, but sometimes there's that gap there between the continuous education and the actual doing and practice of a new skill, bringing it
Yeah.
into the world. Yeah.
Yes, we have to apply it. And quite honestly, it takes a lot of practice to
Sure.
make changes and it's hard work. So I can't say, oh, this is, fun and easy stuff, but I definitely believe that it pays off when we keep at it and little by little we chip away at some of those barriers, and the things that are getting in our way. And then we find that, oh, we actually can do this.
Mm.
It does work if we keep at it.
Boundaries seem to me very much connected to our early development. It seems like something that we might pick up in the family, and almost like the fish swimming in water, like we wouldn't even maybe at first understand that our boundaries were too rigid or too enmeshed, and maybe you can help spell
Mhm.
those ideas out for us, until maybe we have some experiences with other people, other cultures, other environments that have different boundaries than our primary family.
Yeah, absolutely. Like so many things, what we grow up with just feels like the norm, and we We tend to think that, oh, everybody's boundaries are like this. All families operate with these same set of spoken or unspoken rules. But of course, this is very far from the truth. Once you go and visit other people's families or marry into another family, you start to say, oh, yes, families operate in all kinds of different ways. But you're absolutely right that what you experience growing up, it has a big impact on us, right? In so many ways, of course, but our parents tend to be our role models for a lot of what we're learning. And so you can think about, what were the boundaries like in your childhood home? I would say, I mean, if we were going to categorize them, and this is going to be an oversimplification, certainly, but you can think about families that have a lack of boundaries, where there are not clear expectations or rules or limits, and it's a little bit of a free for all. Um, and then there are families that have very rigid boundaries, and that can be very harsh consequences, very harsh rules. There's no flexibility, there's no ability to shift with different situations or different personalities or different people's needs. And then, of course, we have combinations of these. There are certainly families where they really kind of swing back and forth, where there's at times seemingly no boundaries, nobody paying attention to what the children are doing, and then something very harsh, again, as a consequence or a rule for a very particular situation, perhaps.
Mm.
So that's some of what can happen in families. And then you had mentioned enmeshed boundaries, which is is a great term that I think a lot of people are starting to understand more about. Understanding again where there's a lack of boundaries, but what we're really talking about with enmeshed relationships is that not so much that there aren't rules or limits, especially for children, but parents and children that um, I'm trying to think what's another good word to describe that, but there's not a separation between them, so that the child is really seen as an extension of the parent. So they're not allowed to be their unique individual self, and they're not allowed to do some of the normal developmental phases, especially we think about in teenage years, where it's very normal and healthy for children to experiment and explore their own identity. And in a mesh relationship, this would really not be okay. The child is expected to just follow what the parents want them to do. It's very much toe the line, believe what we believe, do what we tell you to do. And like I said, there's not that ability for you to really engage with and explore and be who you are as a unique individual person. And so you can really think about that as stunting one's growth in a lot of areas. And then later on, you can think about that as, often there's resentment that comes
Mhm.
because unfulfillment that comes in your life because you haven't been able to do those things. And either you know what you wanted to do and you weren't able to do it, or you weren't able to be who you wanted to be, or you just don't really know. There can sort of be a lost sense of self because you didn't have the ability to figure out who you are or how you might be different than your parents wanted you to be or who they are.
Yeah, you might, as one discovers that, have to go through it almost like a teenage part of the lifespan again, where you try things out and sort of figure out, like, who am I without those rules, right? Without having to be what someone else wants me to be.
Yeah. I mean, this can happen for other reasons as well, but I mean, certainly there's many people, in midlife who feel like, oh, I don't know who I am. Almost like you've been living your life for somebody else, either for your
Mhm.
parents or sometimes for your children then. But again, there wasn't maybe to begin with a strong sense of identity that really can ground you and give you a sense of identity and self knowledge, and that you really know, okay, this is who I am, this is who I believe in. And that directs so much of our choices and what we do in our lives. And so without that, there is a bit of a sort of, you're just, floating around sort of, I think of those leaves, twirling in the wind, that you're being blown about. And, again, there's nothing that's really grounding you, to say, yeah, this is who I am and this is what matters to me and this is what I want to do with my life.
I feel like some people would really be attracted to folks who don't have very strong boundaries.
That's a good point. Right. I mean, certainly it leaves us susceptible to being taken advantage of or manipulated by people who want to maybe be more controlling,
Yeah.
or, like I said, take advantage of us in different ways. So absolutely, I mean, it can have significant harmful consequences when we don't have boundaries. It does leave us vulnerable. I mean, even in really fundamental safety, physical and emotional safety can be lacking because those boundaries give us a sense of protection. They
Mm.
are there for us to put up some of those limits so that we're saying, no, you can't treat me this way, or it's not okay to do this, or I need something different. All
Yeah.
right. So without that, you're absolutely right. Sometimes maybe it's more intentional that people are looking for people that they can manipulate in those ways, and other times maybe it's just it sort of happens by some sort of attraction. I think that people who are going to be more controlling are going to find people who they can easily control and manipulate. um, but again, I mean, these are things that once we have greater awareness of them, we can start making some changes
Mm.
in relationships and start putting in some of the boundaries that are going to give us the protection that we need and that we deserve.
So, what are some signs that we might want to make some changes? I mean, obviously, feeling like we're being taken advantage of.
hmm Yeah, there's quite a few because, like I said, boundaries can really span so many aspects of our lives. So I think oftentimes what people will recognize is a feeling of resentment or anger,
Mhm.
which is the result of having unmet needs in our relationships. Um, like you said, we can also feel like somebody's taking advantage of us. We might also feel just tired. We're exhausted because we're overgiving or overdoing, overcommitting to things, right? We're not setting any limits that are going to protect our energy. We also might have that sense of a lack of fulfillment. We touched on that a little bit already, but even going a little bit further, part of what happens when we don't have boundaries is if you're just saying yes to everything that comes across your desk or comes into your life, and you're just without hesitation agreeing to everything, you are not going to have the resources, time, energy, money, to prioritize the things that actually matter to you. So again, we're doing things to please other people, but we're not going to be doing the things that are going to bring us fulfillment and that are going to be meaningful to us. So that ends up being, there's a sort of a hole there as well, that I'm just sort of, doing, but it's not bringing me the satisfaction, or I'm not making progress on goals or things that are things that would be important to me.
What about on the other end? If our boundaries are too rigid.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. So that can be equally problematic. And I think this is one of the common mistakes that people make when they go about trying to set boundaries is they go, "Oh, I don't have strong enough boundaries, so let me put up some really strong boundaries because that will be the solution." And that seems logical.
Mm.
but it's a little bit trickier because we need to find that middle ground where we want to have boundaries that are strong enough to protect us, but not so strong and so rigid that we are keeping everybody out.
Right.
Because that's the real problem, is that your boundaries are so rigid and so tight that you're afraid to sort of let them down when you can trust somebody. Those rigid boundaries are going to keep you from like sharing personal things with other people.
Yeah. It's a protection, right? And
Yeah.
I imagine that really both ends could be a result uh, of trauma, because I could see, that protective, rigid boundary, and just knowing even just like what's going to happen during the day, and not be having flexibility in plans or relationships, keeping a feeling of being safe. And on the other end, someone whose boundaries are more, not there, or very, very, very weak, being, more of the pleasing type. And that's another way of keeping the organism safe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're completely right. And I think it makes a ton of sense when you think about it. If you have been hurt by people, that you are going to want to put up really rigid boundaries. Like you said, I mean, it's a natural inclination, self preservation, that you're going to want to, keep people from harming you. And that seems like the obvious way to do it. And then you're right. I mean, part of what happens on the other side is if nobody modeled and taught you how to set boundaries, you're just not going to know how to do it. It is a skill like driving a car or baking a cake. And if you don't have the skill to do it, it's going to be really tough, and it's going to feel really awkward and difficult. Um, and I think oftentimes people have been given some really negative messages about setting boundaries as well. And then that gets in the way. So then they feel guilty about doing it. So again, it's the combination of, nobody showed you how to do this, but on top of that, they said if you do, you're a really bad, selfish person if you're going to say no, and you're not going to loan me money, or you're not going to, help me move, or whatever it is that they're asking you to do. And so then there you are with your weak boundaries, right? Understandably, because
Yeah,
who wants to do something that's going to define them as selfish or mean or terrible person?
absolutely. And I know I'm thinking of some people in my own life who, um just the fear of adjusting those boundaries, if they're known as that friend you can always count on. And it seems like they're just like that great person, but and everyone is loving that. You can always call them for the ride. You can always, and there's an identity in there that one has to maybe lose in order to gain something maybe better.
Yeah, we really put people who are self sacrificing up on a pedestal a lot of times. Like you said, it feels like a really good trait to have, to just give and give and give. Who doesn't like having a friend or a family member like that? But again, I think we have to remember that it's, for one thing, it's not sustainable.
That's right.
The other thing is it's not healthy. We can't just give and give and never replenish and never get our own needs met. Again, this is how we end up completely depleted. We end up physically and emotionally sick when we
Yeah.
do that, because we all have needs and we need to take care of ourselves. And when we're giving and giving, we're really not doing that. And so I think one way that we can try to reframe this for ourselves is remembering that it's healthy for us as individuals, but it's also healthy for our relationships when we have more equity, when there is more of the give and take in our relationships, because the people who really care about you don't want you to be depleted and sick and exhausted all of the time, right? They want you to be a healthy person as well. And a lot
Yeah.
of people will be able to understand that that entails me prioritizing my needs some
Yeah.
of the time. It can't just be all about you all of the time.
Yeah. I find that for some people who really can't do things for themselves, like the framing of you're actually harming the other person by not allowing them to learn to do things for themselves, or like it would help them, they would learn something too, is actually can help those people who just can't change for themselves but can maybe change when they see it that way.
Yeah, I think it's at least a good place to begin with the idea that everybody who loves you will benefit by you taking care of yourself,
Yeah.
right? Self care is not just to benefit me, right? It's just like I said, if I take care of myself, I'm a happier person, I'm a healthier person, I can be more engaged, I can be more productive, I can, have more fulfilling relationships and so forth. And all of that spills over to other people in my life and they benefit as well. I sort of call that the trickle down effect of self-care
Yeah.
is it really is good for everybody, even though in the moment it may seem like they don't understand or they don't like the fact that you're having to say no to something that they need so that you can do something for yourself. But again, there's that give and take that has to happen in relationships, is that we're constantly needing to negotiate and understand each other's needs and make compromises when it's appropriate. But part of that has to be there's a time and a place, and it's fine for me to do things for myself as well.
So if someone is listening to this and they're like, I think I'm that person that needs to make a boundary, shift a boundary, redefine my boundaries, are there things that they could do to prepare? There might be some shifts in the relationships after that. They might be afraid of what's what they might not know what boundary to set, right? You said sometimes we can swing too much in the other direction. Like, where do we start?
Yeah, well, I think like with most things, we want to start small. So we don't want to come into this saying, I'm just going to completely overhaul all of my boundaries in all of my relationships and just do it completely different. It's probably going to be more successful if we start small in terms of either some small shifts in boundaries, but also thinking about, let me start with a few people in my life or a particular situation and feel like I get some competency and some success there. And then I can move on to some more challenging people or some more challenging situations. I always tell people, start with something that's going to be an easier shift. Don't start with the hardest boundary to set and the hardest relationship where there's going to be the most conflict and the most pushback. So, the other thing that we can do is we can practice
Hmm.
and we can figure out ahead of time, what is it that I would need to communicate? How am I going to communicate? What's the best time and the place and the words and the tone? And get yourself prepared for what you need to do. And depending on who you need to set this boundary with, I would say if it's somebody that you're pretty close to, you might even consider talking to this person about the fact that you are going to be making some shifts in some of your boundaries, just to give them a heads up so they don't feel like this is coming out of left field. Like, why are you all of a sudden, saying no to things when you always said yes? And it's really confusing to them. But you can explain to some people, at least. Again, maybe this isn't going to be appropriate for, again, the people who are going to be really resistant to your boundaries, or maybe in a professional relationship, it's not going to be the appropriate thing. But, if you have a close friend or a close family member who you truly believe has your best interest at heart, you might have that conversation where you just explain to them that, I've been having some struggles and I've realized they are related to my lack of boundaries or my overly rigid boundaries, whatever the situation might be. And you say, I'm going to start implementing some changes. And I just wanted to let you know so that you can be supportive and you can help me work through this. And really, so there can be almost a feeling of cooperation and we're in this together. And I want us to figure out how we can make this work in our relationship rather than it feeling like I'm just, coming in with the hammer and, saying no, no, no. And obviously that can be very off-putting to somebody, especially like I said, if they are not anticipating it.
Yeah, I feel like these longer term relationships, we we they have their own like unspoken rules, right? And so I
Mhm.
could imagine being on the receiving end of like a shocking, new boundary, with that person not telling me and just being like, who, like, did something happen? Who is this? So it feels like in a certain amount of cases, a conversation could be very helpful. And it also can get you some support. Like if you bring me in on that, now it's collaborative. Now I'm like invested in that with you.
Right, and it feels like the boundary setting is, it's not just for my benefit, but it's for the benefit of the relationship.
Yeah.
And people may have heard this idea before, but I think it's very true that often we are setting boundaries in an effort to either save the relationship, preserve the relationship, make the relationship stronger, rather than what sometimes people think setting a boundary is really a way of like pushing somebody away or wanting to create space in the relationship. And it's, again, it's not quite that simple because when I come to you and say, I need to say no to some of these requests, or I need for us to communicate in a different way, whatever the boundary is, I'm doing that because I want to have a relationship with you that functions so that we can keep having it, right? Because sometimes the alternative is if we just don't try to set the boundaries that we need, then we might actually go to, I'm just not going to be in this relationship because it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah. So
rather than sort of doing this piece of work, which would be, let's see if we can change things, change this dynamic so that we can both be fulfilled and happy in this relationship.
yeah, I'm hearing like we should uh, receive that as like a calling in, right? As like someone who's like invested in making this better and wants to be there.
Yeah, I think that would obviously be a really healthy response, right? If somebody could hear our boundary in that way, that would be a really good sign for that relationship, I think. Um, and again, we can never control how other people are going to receive our boundaries,
Hmm.
but we certainly can work at trying to explain them and be kind and compassionate. And again, keep showing up and trying to do that work with them rather than, like I said, just being like, this is the way I said it has to be, and there's no flexibility. There are circumstances where that is what needs to happen, especially if there's a real safety issue that's coming up and you need to keep yourself safe or somebody else safe. But I would say in a lot of situations, there is more flexibility and compromise in boundary setting than a lot of people think. Because again, I think when we see things online, it's hard to describe, the nuance of it, and in relationships what really happens. It's much easier to write and just say, it's very black and white. I have to say I'm never going to do this, or this is a non-negotiable for me. And there are definitely some of those in life, but again, especially in close relationships, what we're really talking about is a lot of this compromise, negotiation, prioritizing, trying to have some kind of give and take there, so the relationship works.
Yeah, a lot of gray, right? I imagine, especially for someone who really didn't have the opportunity to, develop their own sense of boundaries, wants, and desires. Figuring this out could be very complicated. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah.
It can feel that way. um and it's not easy, but again, I would say it's something that we can do in small pieces, and also that it doesn't need to be something that you do perfectly. Oftentimes, if you start working on it and you're able to make even a small to moderate amount of change, you can really see some shifts that are meaningful. Again, I think we easily go to the all or nothing thinking of,
Hmm.
I'm a person with no boundaries, or I'm a person with, who's really got this boundary stuff nailed and I'm doing it right all the time. And that's just not realistic for most people most of the time. And again, relationships are just messy, you know,
Yeah.
they are, and they're complicated. And so we're constantly renegotiating these things. And again, while we can certainly identify maybe some consistent boundaries that we need, but boundaries change is really what happens because boundaries are based on your needs. A boundary is there to help you get that need met, and so as your needs change, your boundaries need to change.
So, that's very helpful. So, do we identify some of our more pressing needs? Are there like a list of needs that everyone should think about as they're thinking about, what are their boundaries in those categories?
Yeah, you certainly can go about it that way. I mean, there are definitely universal needs, things that we all need, again, to be basically healthy and to survive and thrive. There are things that are universal for all of us. Um, but even if we don't do that, we can simply start by asking ourselves, what is it that I need right now?
Yeah.
And if that's a tough question to ask, you could back up and say, how do I feel right now? And if that's a tough question, get one of those lists that you can find online that has 500 different feeling, words on it and help you identify specifically what it is that you're feeling, because that feeling is going to help you then say, okay, what is it that I need? So the need is going to the feeling is going to inform you of what the need is.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, you can think of a very simple example. If you're feeling exhausted, what is it that I need? Or I'm feeling hungry, I'm feeling confused, I'm feeling angry. Then that can point you in the direction of what is it that I need that would help me feel better, essentially, or to get this need met.
Yeah.
And even the answer to that question may vary from one day to the next, depending on what's going on. It's going to vary from one person to the next. But that information is then going to help you figure out what is the boundary that I need.
Yeah.
And sometimes that boundary might mean you are going to ask somebody else for something or to make a change, but sometimes that's just going to be a boundary that you need to set for yourself.
Yes. I love that. It doesn't always and even involve someone else. It's like our own boundaries around
Yeah, it's like
our
a whole
habits.
nother set of boundaries are those boundaries that you set for yourself.
That's right.
Right. And that, some of those are going to be things like, I need to turn off my phone at 10 o'clock so that I can go to bed, or I need to, I don't know, a lot of our healthy habits that we create in life are really boundaries, right?
Yes.
They're limits that we are setting for ourselves so that, again, that we can meet our own needs.
I love that. So that we can meet our own needs. I love that. Limits so that we can meet our own needs. I think that's really, really helpful. And understanding, tuning in to the sensation, the emotion, to get an idea of what those needs are and how that informs, okay, I know what I need. Like I know I need 7 hours of sleep at night.
Mhm.
And so I set boundaries, and it's personal. It's with myself. It's also with my partner, right? Like, no, it's that time. And I can hang out with you before that time, but I have to set a boundary around my sleep so that I'm getting those 7 hours. So that like really puts it in context for me. I think I
Yeah,
want to
I
delve into that.
yeah, I think sometimes people forget about that whole category of boundaries because we're so used to thinking of boundaries of being limits that we're setting with other people.
Yeah.
That often the conversation is about, I'm going to say, you need to do this. And while sometimes that's part of setting boundaries, it's not really the most effective way of setting boundaries because we can't make people do any of those things. All we can do is ask, and certainly that's appropriate in some situations, but really the most empowering boundaries are the ones that we say, what change can I make so that I can get this need met?
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm wondering, if we're starting out and we're starting to assert some of these boundaries, and what if it doesn't go the way we dreamed? You know,
It probably won't, like, let's be honest,
right.
right? Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, and I say that, in part because we wanna be realistic about whatever it is that we're trying to do, and understanding that it's not gonna go great all the time, I think helps us weather the storm when that happens so that we don't just give up and say, "Oh, that was a failure. I suck at this. I'm not gonna do it anymore." But if we're going into it saying, "Okay, this is probably not gonna be completely successful or go exactly the way that I want," then we're looking at this, I think, as both this is a lifelong learning process, and boundaries really are something that you're gonna constantly be fine-tuning.
Yeah.
So that could be a specific boundary with a specific person that you're constantly fine tuning, but just boundaries in general. And part of that is because like we had said, they're constantly shifting the boundaries that you need to be setting. So you're never done with the work of setting boundaries. You're always figuring out how can I do it a little bit better or a little bit differently that's going to work for me. And even just I'm changing constantly as a person. So the way that I do everything is changing a little bit
Yes.
over time as well. So it's not something that you're going to get the perfect formula for. Again, I
Yeah.
know people would like there to be the perfect formula, but
They
I think
sure would.
especially, yeah, but again, I mean, especially if you really focus on this idea that okay, I'm going to just keep fine tuning it.
So if someone, said, let's say, I'm not going to go out during the week anymore or something,
Hmm.
like I really need my week time to be more homebody and focus on myself and healthy habits.
Hmm.
Um and then, friend calls Wednesday night, let's go out. And let's say they're like, "Ah, come on. I kept this for a few weeks. I'm going to do it." Right? And
Hmm.
so is there a practice of tuning in, like, when the friend calls, after how we felt, that helps us kind of figure out, like, was it good that I kind of broke this rule or boundary? Or if I'm feeling kind of crummy the next day, like, how do I kind of work with that whole architecture?
Yeah, I think it's a good opportunity for us to practice some self compassion anytime that we have, set out to do something. And then, like you said, it just hasn't gone the way we, like we didn't do what we thought we were going to do or what we had said we were going to do. Instead of just getting into this place of feeling like a failure or something negative about ourselves, this can be a place where instead we can say, again, this is a normal thing that happens.
Yeah.
We all experience these kinds of situations where we don't follow through on something. We start a new healthy habit and then something comes and disrupts it. It's very common. Being super hard on ourselves is not going to be helpful in terms of us improving this boundary or improving our habits. So let's instead sort of frame this as something that is okay. And it can be this opportunity for us to look at it again and say, do I want to stick with this boundary the way I originally set it up? Does that still seem like it's what I need and what will work for me? Or is this a sign that maybe I need to have more flexibility or I want to change this because either I don't need to be as strict of never going out on weeknights or something along those lines where you realize, okay, there could be some in between ground or some exceptions to this, some flexibility here that doesn't have to be like, okay, now I'm like starting over on it or something, versus this being an occasional exception is okay. And again, that's very individual. I can't tell you, is that a good idea or is that not a good idea for you? That's part of that self reflective work that you're going to need to do to say, okay, what would work better for me? And sometimes that's just, I need to experiment a little bit with it. because
Yeah.
that could be also what happens with this example. Um, if you go out on Wednesday and then you find, oh, now I'm going out on Thursday and I've like really lost track of what I was trying to accomplish and not getting things done at home like I wanted to. And you say, okay, well, maybe I need to, go back to being a little bit more firm with this, and this isn't working for me. But it could also be that going out on Wednesday felt really good and you had a good time, and then you're back on track on Thursday and it's wasn't really a problem. And then you realize, oh, maybe I could go out once a week on a weeknight, or I could go out on a weeknight if it's a special occasion or something that's really meaningful to me. Maybe there's, a place for that as well.
It seems like the important part is this part, like the just sitting with, here's what happened, here's how I felt, like, oh, here's where breaking this boundary or opening it up a little had some pluses. I can manage that now where I couldn't before. Maybe I needed a stricter boundary before. Or I can't handle that. Now it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And maybe I can try this again in 3 or 6 months. So it seems like the meat of it is the time that we spend, not the action, which action we took, but the time we spend reflecting on it and learning from it about
Hmm. Hmm.
ourselves.
I think that's a really lovely point because that really speaks to the idea that you're trying to specifically meet your needs, which are different than mine. And like I said, are going to be different than they might even be a month or two from now. And so that's why we're constantly looking at things and assessing what's working for us and what's not working for us.
Yeah.
And again, it's tough and it might sound like it's very time consuming, but I don't think it really needs to be as time consuming as maybe people think it is, but you do need to pause, and say, "Okay, let me spend 10 minutes thinking about this or writing some ideas down and see what comes." I think people might be surprised that again a very modest amount of time spent looking at what's working, what's not working in terms of getting their needs met could be really informative.
Yeah,
We're so busy, 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 or we're sort of checked out, I think is the other side of things is maybe we're not so much busy, but we're on our phones and we're just sort of doing mindless stuff. But that's not, again, and that's fine, for some of our time, but we want to just make sure that there's a little bit of time that there is that place to look inward and connect with ourselves because otherwise we really are just on autopilot all of the time.
that's right.
Either right, the checked out or I'm doing things for everybody else and there's no real looking at, okay, what about me? What is it that I need here? What are the changes that I need to make in order to, I think, have the life that I want to have?
That's so true. This is life now. So, it can be as little, I think, as 2 minutes, but taking that time just to reflect a tiny bit, on your life, your own life, and putting those 2 minutes into just looking at the day, I think is so valuable. Okay.
Mhm. Mhm.
Tell me a little bit, if you can and will and might, about setting boundaries with children. Do you have anything to
Mm.
say about that? As a mom, I
Mhm.
always have to ask.
Yeah, certainly a big part of boundaries with children are limits or rules. I think in a lot of situations we can just use those terms synonymously, that that's what we're talking about. And I think most of us realize that kids need limits, they need rules, it gives them
Yeah,
structure, it gives them safety, it gives them predictability, which are all things that kids need. Um, I'll say a few things, and then if you have any more particular questions, feel free to chime in with them. I think, again, boundaries with kids can go wrong, if you will, either because we're failing to set enough boundaries um, with kids. And many parents are reluctant to set boundaries with their kids because they don't want to be sort of unpopular. They want their kids to like them, they want to be the nice parent. Um, and so there's the again a misperception that setting some limits is going to rupture the relationship
Yeah.
with your children. And then definitely there are many parents on the other side of it who are very rigid and very harsh with the rules and the limits that they are setting. Um, and that's problematic as well for a number of reasons. I don't know how much we want to go into it, but um, so we can end up with issues with boundaries in a couple of different areas with our kids. And then the other thing that I would say is oftentimes parents, in my estimation, have unrealistic expectations of what their children can actually do.
Mm,
And this is a tough one, but I see it so often that part of why parents are frustrated with their kids is because they are expecting them to do things that for the most part are developmentally not possible, either physically or cognitively, that they are making assumptions, for example, about a child's motivation, about why they are doing something that really isn't there, that
yes.
their child is actually acting in a way that is typical, for the 2-year-old or the 10-year-old. And this leads to a lot of frustration
Yes.
in our relationships, um, for the parent and for the child. So, um, yeah, I don't know if there's anything else in particular
Well, that's all very
parenting
touching.
wise.
Yeah. I think I'm seeing both of those things that that you've laid out. There's definitely a swing um toward the kind of no boundary um parenting that I've seen in the more recent generation. That the child is a formed being and knows what they need, and it's not my perception of a child.
Mhm,
um and as well, the which is kind of wild that these both things are happening. On the other end, this like very performance and
mhm,
um unrealistic, like you said, expectations for children for their age. So I think thinking about those two things, um and also I think, like, the question of why am I setting this boundary
mhm,
or
mhm,
rule. And I guess I could ask you, this is about personally what I grapple with sometimes is is balancing the idea that boundaries change, we're changing, they're changing, life's changing, and that kids crave and need consistency.
mm.
And that this is, if you skip a boundary, it's not the same as an adult who can understand. If you kind of change that boundary like one time, you're suddenly doing another thing with the
Mhm,
kid.
mhm. You're right. I mean, again, it's very much the gray area of setting boundaries, um, in general, but certainly with kids, because as as we've been talking about, boundaries need to shift. And I think even within a family, if you have more than one child, what you will find is you want to have a certain amount of consistency between your kids so that there's the same rules essentially, within the family. But the reality is that different kids are very different and they have very different needs. And so you may need different boundaries for different children, or sort of there's a subset of boundaries that are going to be different. And of course, if you have kids who are different ages, which you probably do, and if there's a significant gap in ages, they're definitely going to need different kinds of boundaries, right? Because they have to be appropriate for the age of the child as well. So anyway, that is the complexity of it. And
Yeah.
maybe I would just sort of think about it like there are going to be a certain amount of boundaries that are going to be the same within the family. And those are probably, um, you might think about safety boundaries.
Mhm.
And again, this is the kind of boundaries that every child needs. These are the things that, many of the other kinds of boundaries could differ from one family, to another. But what I would say is all children need some limits that are going to ensure that they are safe, again, physically and emotionally safe. And I would say that should be the priority when setting boundaries, is focus on safety related boundaries. And then beyond that, what I usually say is your other boundaries are going to be determined by both the needs of the child, but also your values as a parent, or um, as a family. You're
Yeah.
going to want to prioritize boundaries that are related to the things that matter most to you.
Yeah.
And sometimes use examples like, in some families, manners, being polite, is a very important value that they have, and they really want to make sure that they have rules around that. For other families, they might say that is not very important to us. What
Yes.
matters to us is, um, education, doing well in school, or whatever it is. And they're going to prioritize limits and boundaries. They're going to, ensure that that's what the focus is. So, again, those are just some differences. There's no right or wrong. It's just realizing, it's not going to work if you make 500 rules.
That's right.
It's
That's right.
tempting, but you're going to have to prioritize the things that matter the most to you.
Yes, they can't follow that many. Um, and
No, and
also, yeah,
and we can't enforce that many,
we
right?
can't enforce that
I
many.
don't want to spend all day,
Oh, right. It's and then you're not
enforcing
having
rules.
any fun. Exactly. It's like you could maybe, but you'd miss out on enjoying your child and your life. And no, what really hit me when you were sharing that is also like the differences in the partners. So
Mhm,
I know
mhm.
there's, who come from two different families. One might be more into manners, one might be more into education and navigating all that. And I think that's a kind of fun and interesting thing as well. And
I don't know if it's fun, but it is a real issue. And yes, I mean, that is something where, again, that's part of the complexity of parenting, is if you have a partner, is that you need to do negotiation with your partner about figuring out what are the boundaries that are we together are going to prioritize,
it's
because
so
that might
important.
be a place, right, where there has to be some give and take. um, because again, if we're on, have very different ideas about the things that are the most important, that's where we can end up with the 500 rules, because I have 250 and you have
That's right.
250, right? Instead of figuring out together, how can we get this down to a reasonable amount? Um, yeah, then we just are all over the place and
I think
unfocused
so.
with
I
it.
think it's really important to kind of to talk about like this is how I grew up and this is what I took from my family as important and I see that you took this as like important and then how do we want our new family to be? Like do we want to bring these things in? Are we bringing them in because they're they're just coming in without actually thinking about if we really want our new family to look like that? So I think all that stuff
Hmm,
is
hmm, yeah.
is important. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that very much goes back to what you were just mentioning, just a little while ago, about really just taking a bit of time to think about those things and be intentional about it instead of just letting it happen.
Yeah.
And that's where, um, I think we can run into some problems because we haven't really been thoughtful about what we want to focus on.
Yeah. Can you talk to us a little bit about boundaries in the workplace?
Mm,
Because sometimes that can
yeah.
be more risky. And I just want to acknowledge that not everyone has the same security in the workplace. Not everyone has the same, you know, resources and ability to just lose their job. It's higher risk for some populations than others. And
Yeah.
I mean, in women, standing up for themselves. I don't know. Look, I think is received differently in the workplace. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we can also bring in just cultural difference and differences within different types of industries. I think there are very different expectations about what kind of behavior is acceptable or encouraged in the workplace as well. So, again, you definitely need to think about your own individual situation. And absolutely, we have to start with an understanding of there are risks that are involved in asserting our boundaries at work. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. It just means that we need to be thoughtful and thinking through, why am I doing this? How important is it? How can I get this need met at work? Are there alternative ways for me to get this need met at work? Because sometimes the most obvious solution, if you will, is not the most realistic
Mhm.
or the safest way to go about it as well. But again, I think you can go back to the idea of thinking about, what is the need that is going to inform the boundary that I need to set here?
Yeah.
And that's going to help you figure out, what are the boundaries that I need at work.
Yeah, I just love that as a framework because if you're always going back to that need, you might get more creative about how you can satisfy the need without putting your position at risk. Um, it gives you more options.
And again, I always like to just come back to also this idea of safety being the most important boundaries generally. And those are the ones that we should be the least willing to compromise on. And sometimes that's what the boundaries that we need at work is, that I think bottom line is, people need to be safe at work.
Yeah.
So, I would say think about that. It's not to say that other boundaries at work aren't important. Certainly, because again, at work, we're talking about complicated relationships and we're talking about power differentials that are very real as well. And so we have to think about, what's realistic here, what's tolerable, and really thinking about, what are all of my options. And I like just the good old fashioned brainstorm. Like,
Mhm.
it's such a basic strategy, but it's a good one because we often get into our head about thinking that there is one particular solution to a boundary struggle that we're having. And often there's a lot of different options for us. And again, I like to come back to the idea of looking at your list of options. How can I solve this problem essentially? And thinking, what are the things that are within my control?
Yeah.
And would any of those be effective here?
Well, that's a great question to ask ourselves.
And that's not always the case, but sometimes it's, what change can I make at work so that I can get my need met, or better met than it is right
Betterment.
now. Yeah. And again, that's another reminder too, that sometimes it's not all or nothing. Sometimes there is a change that can improve things, so it's good enough. But other times, we need something that's more of a significant change. Again, I think if we're talking about issues of safety, I wouldn't want people to be compromising on things that are unsafe.
And as we're kind of nearing the end of our hour, and as we're on this topic of safety, um, I wanted to actually make sure that we didn't conclude without just checking in about the times that it might not be safe to
Mm.
assert a boundary.
Yeah. Well, I think as we've talked about, there can be a variety of different situations where that is the case. So it could be something where we're talking about a work situation. So it's unsafe in the sense that there's a risk that you might lose your job. For example, there might be other situations where um, asserting a boundary, there might be a risk of somebody physically harming you. So, again, very different kinds of risks, but still both important things to acknowledge. And we need to take those things into consideration. And I don't know that there's one specific takeaway in terms of what to do with that. I think one thing maybe that we can universally think about is how could I get some support around this situation? Who else could be involved that would help me
Yeah,
be less vulnerable in this situation?
that's a great
So,
one.
yeah, I mean, I think that might be a good place to think about it. And again, really digging into what are the all of the various possibilities, because the one that you're thinking about right now, in terms of what you want to see as the outcome, might not be the only one that would be acceptable and work okay for you. And again, I think sometimes even if you can talk about that with somebody else, they might
Mm,
have some other ideas too of things that you're not seeing.
yes. Yeah,
But
that's some great
but
advice.
I guess the other thing that occurs to me here is, we could also think about some of these situations where there's risks in asserting our boundaries. Is you could also ask yourself, what is the risk in not asserting my boundaries? Because that is often what we're really talking about. Is there is a trade-off. I can think, if there's a situation with your employer where, there's an unsafe work situation, like maybe they didn't give you the safety equipment that you need to be safe at your job. And so there's a risk in asserting that boundary and saying, I need this safety equipment for me to be able to do my job. And your employer might be angry with you or fire you or whatever. But there's obviously a risk in not asking for it and doing the job without the safety equipment as well. And again, we can have similar examples in our personal life. If you're in a relationship with somebody who is mistreating you, there's obviously a risk in not doing anything and not making any change. But we also know there can be a huge risk in either setting a boundary that's, asking them to behave differently or even trying to leave that relationship. So we've got risks, and it's a lot of negotiating and thinking about which risk is the one that I am willing to take, or how can I better protect myself from any of these risks.
This is fantastic advice. I think looking at your resources, looking at who are your supports, talking to someone about, something an option you might have missed, because especially if we're in high stress, we're not going to see
Hmm.
every solution.
Right.
And then not for, remembering, not forgetting that there's also a risk to not making change. So I
Hmm.
just
Hmm.
love that. I love that, because we often see the risk when we're going to make a change, all the things that reasons we shouldn't do it, but we should also weigh that against the risk of staying.
Absolutely, because we sort of get used to the danger in what we know, right? What we're
Right.
already living with is we've sort of accepted that, but perhaps that's not the risk we want to take. Hmm.
That's right. What do they say? Like the enemy we know, or
Yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Hmm.
Well, you have given us so many good tips. I want to point people toward your new book, because if folks who are listening and watching, if you think you got a lot from this, I mean, you have quite step by step way of writing out, thinking about your boundaries from so many different angles. So, tell us about your book, and anything you want to say about your favorite parts of it, and why people should pick it up and where they should get it.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, just released was the Better Boundaries Guided Journal, and I love this book. It's really just a lovely self-reflective tool. Um, and so there's lots of space for people to write and think about the particular situations, but there's also lots of structured activities in it. So, I might be a little biased, but I think it's really packed full of a lot of great tools for people. And so that's the guided journal. And then I also, a couple of years previously, wrote the Better Boundaries workbook, which I would say is even a more comprehensive guide to learning how to set boundaries. So if people are brand new to setting boundaries, I would suggest the workbook has even more information and more sort of educational pieces to it. But if you are somebody who's been working on boundaries or is wanting to continue to practice and do some of that reflective work, I think the journal is really a great tool as well.
Well, I think people should get both. We can't do too much practice. I love the exercises in your newest book. I love all the frameworks. I mean, you really hit boundaries from every single angle, and there's lots to work on there. Like I said, a lot that we touched on in the episode, but a lot more. And if people want to find you, maybe we can shout out your website and how they can stay in touch with you.
Yeah, yeah. My website is livewellwithsharonmartin.com. So come on over. I got lots and lots of articles and plenty of
Yes.
other free self-help tools and things like that. So yeah, please come on by.
Lots of resources. Thank you so much. We'll put that in the show notes. Thank you for sharing this time with me. I really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks.